The shouting came first, carried on the dry wind, sharp enough to cut through the clink of spurs and the hum of flies in the heat. I stepped out of the saloon's shadow and saw the crowd gathered halfway down the street, every face turned toward the auction block. But the figure in chains wasn't a rustler or a drifter. Caught stealing it was a woman in a tattered white habit, wrists bound, dust clinging to the hem. Men were calling out numbers like they were bidding on a mull, each one higher than the last. She stood straight despite the heat, her eyes fixed on something beyond the mob. And for a moment I forgot the feel of the Colt at my hip. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and tap like and subscribe if you've ever been faced with a choice you knew would change everything. My name's Silas Crow, and I've been riding the frontier near on 20 years now, making my way from the Pecos to the high country without ever calling one place home. I wasn't raised for drifting. My folks worked a patch of rocky land back in Kansas, milking the cows before sunrise, turning soil that fought us for every bushel of corn. We lived by the Sabbath, kept our word, and knew the weight of a handshake. My father believed a man's name was worth more than his purse, and my mother made sure every stranger who came to our door left with a meal in his belly. But the years weren't kind to folks like us. The railroad men came through first, laying steel and talking fast about progress, snapping up parcels for a fraction of their worth. Then came the land speculators dressing like bankers, but with eyes colder than a January creek. Town money started changing the way people looked at each other. Out on the homestead, we mended boots twice before buying new, and the idea of owing another man $1 sat heavy on the chest. In town, silver coins traded hands for a bottle of whiskey without a thought. I learned quick that honesty didn't keep you from going hungry, and that lesson followed me long after I left home. I'd stopped counting the years since I took up my Colt as my trade doing work. Others wouldn't, some lawful, some not. It was a lonely way of living, but it kept me moving, kept the past at a distance. I'd promised myself I wouldn't play hero again, not after the last time it cost me someone I couldn't save. Still, when I saw her standing there calm as a stone in a river, while men barked their prices, something old and dangerous stirred in me. The wind carried the sound of another bid sharper than the rest, and the crowd parted just enough for me to see who'd spoken. Cornelius Blackwood had stepped into the open silver-tipped cane in one hand, that cold measuring look in his eyes. I knew then the day wasn't going to end the way it had started. And when the auctioneer's hammer paused mid-swing, the street held its breath, waiting to see which man would take the prize. The man with the silver-tipped cane stopped in the middle of the street like he owned the ground beneath his boots. Cornelius Blackwood's voice carried without effort, smooth as molasses and just as thick. He tipped his hat toward the auction block, his gold teeth catching the late sun. 500, he said, like he was ordering another round of drinks, not buying a woman in chains. The crowd went still in a way I'd seen before, the hush that comes when folks realize danger has walked in. Everyone in 3 counties knew Blackwood's reach half the land through paper deeds, the other half through blood. I felt my jaw set, but the sound of Catherine's voice reached me before I could move. It was quiet, but carried the kind of plea a man doesn't forget. Don't let him take me. Those words landed heavier than any price I could name. My boots scraped the hard dirt as I stepped into the open eyes on Dutch McKinnon. 200, I called, my voice cutting across the square. It was more than I could spare, but it had the effect I wanted. Dutch's hammer hung in the air, his eyes flicking between us. Blackwood's smile didn't change, but there was a shift in the air like a hot wind before a storm. 600, he answered, slow and deliberate. He didn't even glance at Dutch. His attention stayed locked on me. I knew what that meant. This wasn't about Catherine anymore. It was about seeing whether Silas Crow would back down. My hand hovered near the Colt at my side. Around us, men eased away from the center of the street, clearing space the way folks do when they sense a fight about to break. I weighed my purse. $250 to my name, and Blackwood could have matched me 10 times over without thinking. This was a game he was built to win. Before I could decide my next move, the sun caught a glint of steel from the edge of my vision. One of Blackwood's men had stepped out from behind the freight office, rifle in hand. 5 more emerged from shadow, all armed, all watching me. Blackwood didn't have to say it, but he did anyway. "Not your town, Crow. Not your fight." That was when Catherine's chains rattled against the wooden post. She'd shifted just enough for her eyes to meet mine. I saw fear there now. But I also saw something else, the kind of trust that forces a man's hand. My Colt cleared leather before I realized I'd made the choice. Auction's over. I told Dutch, the barrel pointing at his chest. The first shot came from somewhere to my left. I hit the ground behind a water trough, wood splintering above me. Catherine gasped, her voice sharp against the roar of gunfire. Bullets chewed into the dirt, and the air filled with the bitter tang of black powder. Blackwood's order cut through the chaos. "Take him alive. I want him to watch." I rolled toward the blacksmith's anvil, counting shots and angles. 3 closing in from the left, 2 holding their ground near the general store, and 1 moving wide to flank me. 30 yards to the livery would mean cover and a way out. But it would also mean leaving her. My teeth clenched. I'd walked away before. Not this time. Then, Catherine began to sing. Her voice rose above the gunfire, steady and clear, carrying the words of amazing grace into the smoke-filled air. The gunfire faltered. For a few breaths, even the killers paused. I used that sliver of a quiet to move, putting 3 rounds into the dirt near the closest rifleman's boots, driving him back. I reached the auction block in time to see Dutch clamp a derringer to Catherine's temple. "Don't move, Crow," he hissed. Sweat running down his face, the crowd's silence pressed in around us, waiting for my next step. Behind Dutch, Blackwood called out, "Drop it, and maybe we'll talk." Catherine's gaze stayed fixed on me. No blame, no plea, just that same unshaken trust. I lowered the Colt, kicked it toward the edge of the square. Blackwood took a few steps forward, satisfied. "Thought you had more fight in you," he said, almost like it disappointed him. Dutch's grip shifted just slightly on the derringer, and in that slip of control, Catherine moved. She bit down hard on the fleshy web of his hand. The gun fired wild, the shot vanishing into the bright sky. I pulled the knife from my boot and let it fly. It buried itself in Dutch's chest, dropping him to the boards. Blackwood's men came alive again, guns barking. But I was already pulling Catherine toward the general store. We dove through the doorway, splinters chasing us in. She leaned against the wall. Her habit streaked with dust and a thin line of blood, her breath quick. I checked my ammunition, 3 rounds left. "Why?" she asked between breaths. "Why are you helping me?" I didn't look up from the Colt, because nobody deserves what he had planned for you. Her hands trembled, but her eyes held steady. I bit him, and I felt satisfaction. I should feel shame, but I don't. Does that make me evil? "Makes you human," I said, sliding the cylinder closed. Outside boots scuffed against the porch. Blackwood was coming himself now, and I knew the next few minutes would decide whether we walked out at all. Blackwood's shadow filled the doorway, the light behind him turning his outlines sharp against the smoke curling into the store. The shotgun in his hands gleamed where the barrels caught the window light. He didn't rush. He stepped in slow, each boot heel heavy on the worn boards. "End of the line, Crow." He said, his voice calm, as if we were discussing the weather. "You and your nun are coming with me." I shifted, so I stood between him and Catherine, measuring the space. Too far to close before he pulled those triggers, too close for him to miss. He looked almost amused, eyes flicking past me toward her. "Funny thing," he went on, "I wasn't planning to buy her. Just came to town for supplies. But then I saw you making your play, and I do like taking things from men who think they're heroes." Catherine stepped forward, surprising both of us. "If it's me you want, take me. Leave him alone." Her voice didn't tremble, but Blackwood's smile deepened. "It doesn't work that way, sister. Your friend here killed 3 of my men in Deadwood. Burned a schoolhouse they did with children inside." I felt her eyes on me. She asked, "Is that true?" My gaze stayed on Blackwood. "They had it coming," I said. The children, she pressed her voice quieter now. "I killed men," I answered. "That's what I do." She touched my arm briefly. "That's not all you do." Blackwood's patience thinned. "On your knees, both of you." Before I could answer, the back door creaked open. An older woman's voice rang clear. "Cornelius Blackwood, you get out of my store this instant." Martha Weaver stepped into view, Spencer rifle in her hands, the barrel steady as a fence post. Her hair was pinned back tight, her eyes unblinking. "This is my place, and I don't allow shooting inside. That girl's wearing the habit of St. Agnes. Sister Mary Catherine, isn't it?" Catherine's eyes widened. You know me?" Martha nodded. "Your mother, Margaret O'Rourke, helped deliver you in this very store during a blizzard. Prayed over you every day she had breath." Blackwood looked between them, his grip on the shotgun tightening. Catherine's voice was strained. "My parents died when I was 3. The sisters raised me." Martha shook her head. "Your father didn't die, child. He was run out of town for cheating at cards. Your mother, God rest her, died bringing your younger brother into this world." Catherine's face drained of color. "Brother Tommy O'Rourke." Martha said, voice heavy. "Wild as his father, mean when he's drinking. Rides with a gang now, calls himself Quick Draw Tommy." The name hit me like a hard punch. I knew it, and so did every lawman in 3 territories. Killer thief untouchable in a gunfight. Catherine's knees buckled and she braced herself against the counter. "No, that's not... I've prayed for peace my whole life." Blackwood's tone sharpened. "Well, now this gets interesting. Your brother robbed my silver shipment last month. Killed 6 of my men. But before he rode off, he told one survivor, 'Tell Blackwood this is for what he did to my sister.'" His smile turned mean. "What do you suppose he meant by that?" The truth slid into place. "You set this up," I said. "Had her taken brought here to draw him out." Blackwood didn't deny it. "Bait works best when it's alive. Figured he'd come storming in. Instead, I get you." Catherine's voice was hollow. "He's coming." Blackwood corrected her, "Already here, watching from the church bell tower for the past hour." That was when the sound reached us, hoofbeats, hard and fast, rolling in from the edge of town. Martha swore under her breath. "Tommy and his gang." I glanced at Catherine. She was caught between the faith she'd built her life on and the blood she couldn't change. The riders drew closer, their leader's whistles slicing through the air. Catherine moved to the window, peeking between the curtains. 5 men, faces covered, rifles catching the sun. The one in front rode like he'd never known defeat. "Tommy," she breathed. "Send her out." Tommy's voice called across the street. "And maybe I'll kill you quick." Martha's rifle didn't waver. "This girl's under my roof. That makes her under my protection." Catherine straightened. "I'm going out there." I caught her arm. "Like hell. You'll be facing your brother and what you are." She didn't back down. "Then maybe it's time I stopped running from it." Outside, Tommy called again. 10 seconds, Blackwood." Catherine pulled free, her eyes steady. She reached down and picked up my Colt from where it lay near the door. She checked the cylinder with a skill that didn't belong to a stranger to guns. Martha's voice was low. "Where'd you learn that?" Catherine's answer was flat. "Some sins follow you no matter how much you pray." 5 seconds, Tommy shouted. Catherine's grip tightened. She looked at me once, then pushed open the door and stepped into the street. Catherine stepped down into the street, her boots settling in the dust like she'd walked that stretch her whole life. The torn white of her habit moved in the breeze, and in her hands my Colt rested steady, muzzle low, but ready. 30 yards out, the man at the head of the riders eased his horse to a stop. When he pulled the bandana from his face, there was no mistaking the match, same eyes as hers, only hardened by years of violence. Katie Tommy O'Rourke said, using a name I'd never heard on her. "What did they do to you?" His gaze cut past her toward the store, toward Blackwood and me, then back to her face. "They showed me who I really am," she answered. "Who we are." Her voice carried even with the dry wind picking up. Tommy's hand rested near the butt of his revolver, but he didn't draw. "You're my sister. That's all that matters. We're leaving, all of us." "No," Catherine said the word, firm. "I'm not running anymore. Not from you. Not from our name, not from myself." The air between them felt taut, every man watching for the twitch that would bring the first shot. I stepped out of the store, then keeping my eyes on Tommy's gang. Martha moved with me, the Spencer rifle snug against her shoulder. Blackwood followed, his shotgun balanced in both hands, the barrel drifting from one side of the street to the other. Tommy's voice softened, but there was an edge to it. "You always were too good for your own good. But good doesn't survive out here. Maybe it's time someone tried," she said. Her tone didn't waver, but her fingers tightened on the Colt. Tommy's draw was as quick as his name claimed, but Catherine's was quicker. Her shot cracked across the street, kicking dust from the boards by his hand. His revolver spun away, clattering against a hitching post. He stared at her, shock written plain on his face, blood running from the crease along his fingers. "Katie, you shot me." "I shot your hand," she replied. "You'll live, but you won't kill anyone else today." One of his men jerked his rifle up, but I was already sighting. 2 rounds dropped the first pair of riders before they could get a bead. Martha Spencer barked once, and a third man tumbled sideways from his saddle. The last 2 looked at Tommy, looked at the blood in the street, then wheeled their horses and rode hard out of town. The silence that followed was the kind that doesn't last. Blackwood lowered his shotgun, the glint in his eyes more like calculation than defeat. "Well played, sister. Though I doubt you'll be heading back to the convent after this." Catherine looked at the Colt in her hand, then at her brother kneeling in the dust. "No, I don't suppose I will." Her gaze lifted to me. "I'm not the woman you thought you were saving. And I'm not the man you thought saved you," I said. "Question is what now?" She slid the Colt into an empty holster at her side with a smoothness that made it seem like it had always been there. "Now we figure out how to live with who we are." Blackwood stepped back toward the boardwalk, his gold-toothed grin returning, though fainter now. "Enjoy your reunion. Some debts don't settle so clean." He disappeared into the shadows between buildings, his men following. Tommy sat there, cradling his injured hand, not saying another word, as the first townsfolk began to peek from doorways. Somewhere in the distance, the bell at St. Agnes tolled the hour, and the sound carried over the empty street. Martha kept her rifle on Tommy until the deputy arrived from the edge of town, breathless and wide-eyed at the scene. "Territorial prison," Martha told him. "And keep him there." By the time they loaded Tommy into the wagon, the light had shifted. Shadows from the false fronts reached almost halfway across the street. Catherine stood beside me, the dust from the scuffle settling around our boots. Whatever came next, I knew the day's end had only drawn a line under the real fight ahead. The wagon carrying Tommy rolled away under the watch of 2 deputies, wheels crunching through the ruts at the end of the street. Dust trailed after it, curling in the late afternoon light until the sound of hoofbeats faded. Catherine stood beside me, her eyes following the wagon, until it disappeared over the ridge. She didn't say a word, but her grip on the Colt at her side told me enough. Whatever she felt, she wasn't letting it show to the crowd, gathering again along the boardwalks. Martha stepped forward, lowering her Spencer rifle only once Tommy was out of sight. "He's his father's son," she said, not unkindly. "But you've still got a chance to be something else." Catherine gave her a small nod and slid the Colt into her belt. We moved back into the store, the air inside holding the stale tang of gunpowder from the fight. Martha busied herself behind the counter, pouring water into a tin cup and handing it to Catherine. She drank slowly, her gaze fixed on the warped boards at her feet. I could hear the hammering of a farrier's work down the street, the faint ring of steel on steel carrying into the quiet. "You've made yourself an enemy in Blackwood," Martha said, her eyes flicking toward the open doorway. "He won't take being embarrassed in his own territory." I'd been thinking the same since the moment he stepped off the boardwalk and vanished between the buildings. Catherine set the cup down, the tin clicking faintly against the counter. "Then it's time I stop thinking like a nun and start thinking like someone who wants to live." There wasn't defiance in her tone, so much as a simple acceptance of fact. I told her she'd need a place to stay where Blackwood's eyes couldn't find her so easy. Martha suggested the small room above the store, nothing more than a cot, a washstand, and a narrow window. But it had a lock on the door and only one way up. Catherine agreed without hesitation. By the time we'd seen her settled, the light outside had thinned to a copper wash. The town had mostly gone quiet, save for the low murmur from the saloon and the squeak of a swinging sign in the breeze. I stood on the porch with Martha, both of us scanning the street like we were expecting something. "He'll move fast," she said, her voice low. "Men like Blackwood don't stew long." I didn't doubt it. The question was whether he'd come for her straight on or try to bleed her out with smaller moves, first cutting off supplies, turning folks against her, letting someone else's hand do the work. Catherine joined us on the porch, the lamplight from inside catching on the small wooden cross still hanging at her throat. It seemed out of place against the gun belt she now wore, but she didn't try to hide either. "I can't just sit in a room and wait," she said. "If I do, he's already won." Martha glanced at me, then back to her. "You're right about that. But you need to be smart about your first move." Catherine considered that, then looked down the street toward the far end of town, where the land rolled away into open country. "Tomorrow," she said, "I start looking for work. Something that keeps me close to people. The more eyes on me, the harder it'll be for him to act without being seen." It was a sound enough idea, but it meant walking into places where Blackwood's reach was long. I told her I'd stay close for the next few days at least, until we got a sense of how he meant to play this. Night had nearly settled when we finally closed up the store. The streets emptied, lanterns flickering in windows, the air cooling under a pale slice of moon. As I turned to head upstairs, a sharp rap sounded at the door. Martha opened it to find a boy of maybe 12, his hat too big for his head and his breath coming quick from running. "Message for Miss O'Rourke," he said, holding out an envelope smudged with dust. Catherine took it, her eyes narrowing as she broke the seal. Whatever she read, she didn't share, not yet. She just folded the paper, once slid it into her belt beside the Colt, and said, "We'll need to talk in the morning." Catherine didn't say much over breakfast. She'd brought the sealed note down from her room, but it stayed tucked under her palm on the counter while Martha poured coffee and I cut into a skillet of eggs. The lamplight was still needed in the store, though the first hint of daylight pushed through the upstairs window. When she finally slid the paper toward me, the edges were already softened from handling. "It's from a man named Elias Trask," she said. "Claims he's got work for me out at his freight yard." Martha's brow lifted. "Trask does business with Blackwood's people." Catherine met her gaze. "That's why I think I should go. If he's sending me a message, I'd rather face it than guess at it." I unfolded the paper. The writing was tight and deliberate, an invitation to meet at noon, offering opportunity and mutual benefit. It didn't read like a threat, but the tone was heavy with someone expecting the upper hand. By late morning, the air had warmed enough to carry the scent of horses and grain from the livery. Catherine wore a plain skirt and blouse Martha had found her, the colt hidden under the hem of a short jacket. I saddled my mare while she checked the load on her revolver, and together we rode out toward the row of weathered sheds on the edge of town where Trask kept his freight wagons. He was waiting in the shade of a barn. A lean man in his 40s, with a vest that didn't match his trousers and a pocket watch chain bright against the dust. "Miss O'Rourke," he greeted, nodding first to her, then to me. "I was hoping you'd come alone." "I don't take meetings with strangers alone," she said evenly. Trask didn't argue. He gestured toward a bench by the wall, and we sat while he leaned against a post, rolling a toothpick in his mouth. "Word travels fast in this territory," he began. "Folks say you've got grit. Blackwood's been testing that. I could use someone with grit." Catherine crossed her arms. "And what would you want in return?" Information Trask said without hesitation. "Blackwood moves certain goods through town, things that don't pass through the regular ledgers. You're close enough now to see more than most. You tell me what you see, and I'll make sure you've got protection." I watched her face as she weighed the offer. The risk was plain step into Trask's circle, and she'd be between two men who'd think they owned her. But walking away meant letting them both work in the shadows. "I'll think about it," she said, finally rising to her feet. Trask didn't try to stop her. "Don't take too long," he warned. "Blackwood doesn't give second chances, and neither do I." We left the freight yard with the sun high and hard in our eyes. Back at the store, Martha was weighing out flour for a customer, but looked up quick when we came in. Catherine gave her the short version, leaving out the part where she hadn't said no. Through the afternoon, she worked alongside Martha, stocking shelves and sweeping the porch, the steady rhythm of it making the earlier meeting seem almost distant. But I could see in the way she glanced toward the street that it stayed with her. Near sundown, as we were pulling in the barrels from out front, a rider came down the street at a slow walk. His coat was the color of dry sage, and he tipped his hat to no one. The horse's hooves made a muffled thud in the dust until he stopped in front of the store. He leaned in the saddle, holding out a folded slip of paper. "For Miss O'Rourke," he said. Catherine took it, but when she looked up again, the rider was already turning his horse toward the far end of town. She opened it there on the porch, her eyes scanning the few words inside. "It's from Blackwood," she said quietly. "He wants to meet. Alone." The paper shook just slightly between her fingers, though her voice stayed level. "Tomorrow at the old stage depot." The wind shifted, then bringing the scent of rain from somewhere beyond the ridge. The morning came clear, the rain that had threatened the night before never touching town. Catherine was already downstairs when I came in from the stable, her jacket buttoned and the note from Blackwood folded in her hand. Martha had been trying to talk her out of going, but Catherine didn't look the sort to be moved by another warning. We set out just past mid-morning, the two of us riding in silence toward the old stage depot. It sat a half-mile outside town, the road dipping between low hills before opening on the sun-bleached building. The place had been abandoned for years, its roof-lined sagging boards gray from weather. A single hitch rail leaned at an angle out front. Blackwood's black carriage was already there. He stood in the shade of the depot's porch, coat open, hands clasped loosely behind his back. Two of his men flanked the doorway, rifles in easy reach. When we stepped down from our horses, he smiled like this was nothing more than a social call. "Miss O'Rourke," he greeted, his gaze slipping past me to her. "Mr. Crow, I wasn't expecting you." "You invited her," I said. "You get me too." Blackwood let the pause stretch before nodding toward a bench along the wall. "Then let's talk where the sun isn't so unforgiving." We didn't sit. Catherine stayed just inside the shade, her stance even hands-free, but close enough to her jacket for anyone to guess what she carried. "What do you want, Blackwood?" she asked. He stepped forward a fraction enough for the light to catch on the gold caps of his teeth. "You've disrupted my business, humiliated me in front of men whose respect is measured in blood. Now I'm a reasonable man. You can make this right." "And if I don't?" she asked. His smile didn't move. "Then I make an example of you, and of anyone who stands with you." His eyes shifted toward me, then back to her. "But if you do, I offer you something rare. Control, a position under my protection. You'd be untouchable in this territory." Catherine didn't blink. "You mean I'd belong to you?" "I mean you'd survive," he said, his voice dipping lower. "Your father didn't learn that lesson. Your brother hasn't either, but you could be different." For a moment I thought she might answer him then and there, but she only said, "I'll think on it." She turned toward the sunlight, giving him her back like she trusted me to watch it. I did. We mounted without another word. Blackwood stayed on the porch, watching us ride away. His men didn't move until we were beyond the bend in the road. Back in town, Martha was waiting outside the store. She searched our faces as we dismounted, but Catherine only said, "He offered me safety at the cost of everything else." Martha's frown deepened. "He's never going to stop pressing, not while you've got something he thinks he can use." That evening, as the last of the daylight slipped behind the ridge, a single rider came in from the west. He carried no badge, but the way folks stepped aside as he passed told me he was a man known here. He reined up in front of the store, pulling a folded paper from inside his coat. "Message from Judge Harlan," he said, handing it to Catherine. "Says it concerns your brother and a hearing in Carson's Crossing." She looked at me once before breaking the seal. Whatever was written there pulled the corners of her mouth tight. "We leave at first light," she said. "This isn't finished." We rode out before sunrise, the air still carrying the cool of night. Carson's Crossing lay 12 miles east, the trail cutting through open range before dipping into the valley where the courthouse stood. Catherine kept a steady pace, her shoulders set against whatever waited for us there. The town was already stirring when we arrived. Judge Harlan had taken a room above the telegraph office, and by the time we stepped into the small courtroom, a dozen locals had gathered on the benches. Tommy sat at the defense table, his injured hand bound in fresh linen. Blackwood stood near the rear wall, watching like a man measuring every move for advantage. Harlan called the hearing, to order his voice carrying without strain. The charges against Tommy were laid out: plain armed robbery, multiple counts of murder, destruction of property. Catherine didn't flinch, though I could see her jaw tighten with each word. When the judge invited testimony, she stepped forward. She spoke without notes, telling the room how she'd faced her brother in the street, how she'd taken his gun hand rather than his life. She didn't excuse his crimes, nor did she let Blackwood's presence change her tone. "Justice isn't revenge," she said simply. "But it's not mercy if you turn away from the truth." Blackwood shifted in the back, but Harlan's attention stayed on her. When she finished, the judge rendered his decision. Tommy would serve his sentence in the territorial prison without parole, his property seized to compensate the families of his victims. As the deputies led Tommy out, he looked at Catherine, once something unreadable passing in his eyes. She didn't speak, only nodded, and then he was gone. Blackwood lingered a moment longer, his gaze moving between us. Then he tipped his hat with a thin smile and stepped into the sunlight. Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying the scent of pine from the hills. Catherine stood on the boardwalk, looking out over the street. "It's done," she said, though her voice held both relief and the weight of finality. We rode back to Perdition that afternoon. By the time we reached town, the shadows were long, stretching across the empty street. Martha was waiting on the porch of the store, her arms folded. Catherine smiled for the first time in days. "I'm staying," she told her, "if you'll have me." Martha nodded once. Plenty of work for someone who doesn't scare easy. In the weeks that followed, Catherine traded her borrowed clothes for practical ones she could work in. The Colt stayed at her side, but so did the small wooden cross. She found her place in the rhythms of the town, helping at the store, watching the road for trouble, lending a hand where it was needed. As for me, I stayed too. Some evenings we'd sit on that porch with Martha, the lantern light spilling onto the boards, talking quietly while the night settled in. We didn't speak much about the fight with Blackwood or the trial in Carson's Crossing. Those things were behind us, though the lessons they carried stayed close. Out here, you don't always get to choose the blood in your veins or the trouble that finds you. But you can choose who you stand beside and the kind of name you leave behind. Catherine had made her choice. So had I. If you've ever stood at that kind of crossroads, you know it's not about what you walk away from. It's about where you decide to stop running. And sometimes that place becomes home. Before you go, I'd like to hear your thoughts. Have you ever had to stand your ground when it would have been easier to turn away? Share your story, and I'll see you next time.